Well, hi everyone, Ron Vaillant here. We have a bombshell information dump to give you in regards to UNDRIP going forward in Canada. It's been very difficult to get people to wrap their brain around this, but now we have some good documentation that people can go and look at. And I'll put the link below where you can go and look at the document. But UNDRIP, for those who don't know, is the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it's an absolute kill shot to anything that any state that would implement it. Article 26 says that the Indigenous have the rights to the lands, territories, and resources to which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used. Article 46 says that nothing in the Declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, people, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act contrary to the Charter of the United Nations. And you have the federal government has gone ahead and passed Bill C-15, which says that all Canadian law has to be in alignment or consistent with UNDRIP. You have BC, they went ahead in 2019 in October, adopted UNDRIP as a province, and now we're looking at Vancouver. And this is really good in the sense that it's a lot easier for people to wrap their brain around maybe a city and what's going on here. So what has happened now, the City of Vancouver's UNDRIP strategy has been released. It's a report of the UNDRIP task force to the City of Vancouver Mayor and Council. This is October 25, 2022. And we're just kind of skip through some of these things here, some of the points that are brought into this whole thing. And this is on page 7, recommendations for Council's consideration. Whereas the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people are the original stewards of the lands known as the City of Vancouver. Okay? And it says here, the second paragraph, the City of Vancouver, known as the city, voted unanimously on June 24th, 2014, it's a long time ago, to acknowledge that the city is on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and I'm sorry, it's hard for me to pronounce that, Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and the city adopted a reconciliation framework in 2018. So basically, Vancouver is on someone else's land, is what they're saying. And on page 9, second paragraph, it says that, I'm just going to say the three bands to make it simpler on me. The three bands are the original stewards and rights and title holders of this land. So they're saying that they basically are the title holders of the land. Fundamental calls to action on page 11 talks about, in number 1, it says identify and implement options for new rights-based governments. So they're going to go and change the governance model to include these three bands. Number 4 says establish a process for the city to look for embedded colonialism within its systems and to reshape its own internal policies, procedures, and bylaws in ways which recognize and respect the laws and governance of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Okay, looking at page 13, cultural section, and midway in the first paragraph it says the city is a colonial government which has played an active role in displacing Indigenous peoples and imposing Western systems and values onto these lands, and therefore has a responsibility to take action in remedying and accounting for these harms. And then it goes on talking about restoration of the original languages. So this is a big deal. They want to be able to prioritize access to cultural sites. Going on page 15, the very last paragraph, economic. The Indigenous rights and title includes rights to economic self-determination and wellness. So colonialization has severely impacted the economies and well-being of Indigenous peoples. I don't really understand how that works, but okay, so they've been excluded from benefiting and enjoying the abundance of their lands and resources, interfering with their rights to economic sovereignty. Barriers to prosperity, such as restricted access to land and resources, impact each nation. UNDRIP Article 20.2 affirms that Indigenous peoples deprived of their means of subsistence and development are entitled to just and fair redress. The city has a responsibility to redress the losses experienced by the Musqueam, Squamish, and Salwati peoples. So with that, on page 16, they want to identify ways to amplify and solidify meaningful participation in building and sharing Vancouver's economic prosperity, including for economic partnerships, revenue sharing arrangements, ongoing funding agreements, redress agreements, allocation of property and other taxes to nations, and city fee and tax waivers. To make the city an employer of choice for Indigenous workers, to ensure contract opportunities are reserved for business owned by and partnered by the Musqueam, Squamish, and Salwat. Sorry I'm butchering that, but I'm trying my best here. Also, this would include the first right of refusal for these bans for city land dispositions. Okay, now on page 17, we have, it starts off with environmental racism. I didn't know there was such a thing. Environmental hazards disproportionately impact indigenous communities. Oh, really? Hazardous industrial projects and other disruptive impacts from colonialization and urbanization infringe on the ability of these bands to exercise their inherent constitutional and human rights. So they want to conduct a review of hazardous industrial projects from the lens of Indigenous rights, co-develop and implement a policy, that's 2.3, Section 2.3, to assess the current and future industrial infrastructure development through the lens of Indigenous rights and title and environmental racism. To also 2.4 section here to ensure that these bands are engaged in the city's environmental initiatives, to ensure that they address environmental racism, climate action strategy, healthy water plans, urban tree canopy, equitable green space access, traffic and pollution exposure mitigation. Maybe you won't be able to drive in Vancouver not in a not too distant future. Going down on the very last section of page 17, leasing, housing, and land. The colonial appropriation and occupation of the territories have directly, unequivocally led to loss of land base, homes, housing, and community for Indigenous peoples. The unceded lands continue to be occupied, leased, and developed without the consent or involvement of Indigenous right holders. Policy and programs are needed for the bands to access housing on their own lands and beyond residential lands, reserve lands. So that's page 17. Page 19 talks about reconciliation curricula sharing, and they want to be able to inform people about themselves. Identify ways to ensure that they are informed about leases and have input on what is occurring on the land. So they want to co-develop criteria for what types of lease renewals should be reviewed, and to co-develop a plan for city land transfers. They also want in section 213 to co-develop policies, programs, and processes to ensure that Indigenous people in Vancouver feel safe in accessing municipal services. Okay, on the very bottom of page 19, 217, it says to work with and recommend that the Vancouver Police Department Commit to integrating the articles of UNDRIP. Going on to page 19, that continues on with that idea. Work with and recommend that the Vancouver Police Department address systemic and structural racism in ways that recognize and support and build upon Indigenous community initiatives. To include the bands and the diverse Indigenous populations living in the city in the development of the Police Board annual police business and strategy plans to ensure that the priorities are upholding UNDRIP. So they're going to get the police heavily involved in all of this. Okay, page 21. Revenue sharing. It says over time the City of Vancouver has generated enormous wealth from unceded lands and has expropriated lands and has not compensated the rights and title holders. Recognizing Vancouver as unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands means addressing the inequities and loss created by land and resource disposition. There are domestic and international examples and precedents of revenue sharing arrangements between governments and Indigenous peoples that can inform this work. So this is what they're talking about doing in section 3.1. Identify options for revenue sharing through property taxes. Example, by sharing a portion of existing new property taxes to distribute to the various bands. 3.3 talks about identify other options for revenue sharing, including but not limited to levies, fees, and taxes raised by the city. Funds should be distributed to these bands in a fair and equitable manner. You've heard about equitable. That's a UN buzzword. 3.4, to identify options for the bands to generate revenue. Prioritize training, employment for Indigenous people with developers, including establish guidelines for developers, including train and employ Indigenous peoples in their projects. On page 22, it talks in section 3.8, work with these bands to identify priority parcels of land which are culturally, economically, and socially significant to be repatriated, with the end goal of having these lands given back. 3.9 talks about these bands having a say on leases signed by the city. Section 3.9 talks about these bands having a say on the leases signed by the city. 3.10 talks about ways for these bands to assert greater influence on city strategies, plans, and projects. Going to page 24, it talks about, in section 4.4, identify ways to support these bands to restore their Indigenous laws within their own communities and across the city, and weave them in more fully into local decision-making processes, including each nation's own legal review of the city's projects and plans. They're going to have their hands in everything. Page 25, 4.7. Okay, identify ways for these bands to practice their traditions on the land, including but not limited to co-develop mechanisms and agreements for co-management and transfer of title of parks. On page 26, it talks about establishment of institutions, and it says the city played a role for disrupting the original legal, governance, and educational system of the bands, and so the city has a role to play in supporting their restoration. So there'll be a whole big deal about that. So on page 27, they talk about early actions. They want to rename various different assets in regards to the various different bands. Action 3 is build upon the socials procurement framework and expand the procurement policy to prioritize Indigenous participation in all projects. Early action 5 would be to develop the process and requirements for event organizers to engage and partner with the MST. Early action 6, provide a spectrum of mandatory anti-racism and Indigenous cultural safety training for employees. There's going to be a bunch of anti-racism training, because when people really find out what's really going on, and this whole big land grab and the implications of it all, people are going to be pretty upset. And this is not going to be good. The UN is using the Indigenous to forward their Agenda 2030 and to make it so that we'll be happy and own nothing. And so people are going to get very upset about this. And the Indigenous need to realize that they're being used as pawns, and it's not going to go well for anyone here. On page 28, it says the UN Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a framework of minimum standards. And if you read the Indigenous rights of peoples that they put forward there, it gives them tremendous rights, exclusive rights that no one else will have. And that is so far over the top. And for them to say now it's minimum standards, there's going to be no end to all of this. Okay, so yeah, so that's kind of just glancing through this whole thing. It's not very good, but people need to realize that this is going on. It's not just a horror movie script that you can walk away from and it goes away. This is really happening, and this is going to happen. This is Vancouver right now, but it's going to happen in every city and town and area in Canada. And for those who are listening abroad, the US and other countries in Europe and whatnot, this is global. It's all going on behind the scenes, as it's been going on behind the scenes for years here. Only it's been revealed by whistleblowers like myself and others who are letting people know about it, because the politicians, the mainstream media, are all very quiet about it as to identifying really the true implications of all of this. And it's only going to be fully revealed when basically you get a letter in the mail saying that you're on someone else's land, and then you need to start paying fees, or you need to get off the land. And yeah, so anyhow, you need to share this out. We'll probably do an update in the future on this, but for right now, this is it, and it's happening, and it's right in real time. All right. Take care, and download the documents and start sharing with others. Bye.